What is happening, guys? Welcome one and all to the Severe MMA preview show. Paul Brown here, and it is just me this week. We're giving Ian O'Neill a few days to recover and recharge after his excellent work covering UFC Edmonton. If you caught up on any of his coverage, his appearances at the press conference, he was probably the best thing about the whole event. The card itself was, yeah, maybe a bit devoid in entertainment value and some highlights, but Ian did a fantastic job, and he got some good interviews, some good footage, some good questions he threw at Dave Shaw as well. And particular nugget was the question he asked him about a possible UFC Dublin. Maybe we actually got a little insight into what's actually happening in that regard. In that there is actually nothing happening, and there's most likely not going to be anything happening, which I thought was the case anyway. But it was nice to hear someone maybe get some information on it one way or the other, because we've sort of been led a little bit of a merry dance over the last couple of years with the possibility of a card happening here, haven't we? So he's not with us this week, and Shawnee, Shawnee is trucking along doing his thing, but listening to his Q&A today, and he said he's a little bit under the weather. So I thought I'd just, given that we don't have a hell of a lot of MMA happening this weekend, or a hell of a lot worth previewing, we only have a couple of snippets of fights. So I thought we'd give Shawnee the day off too. And it's just me, so I will keep it brief today, but just want to update you guys on what is going down this weekend, what is happening. Overall, with cards, let's see what's happening this weekend. There's quite a few things going on the smaller scale, but there's generally not big ones going on. Octagon, of course, is on, and we've an Irish fighter in there. Jack Maguire from Cork is making his comeback. Well, he had one fight on St. Paddy's Day this year in Tenerife on the Fight to One promotion. So he's got a tough fight in front of him. It's a 68 kilo catchweight fight as well. Now, Jack has fought mostly as a bantamweight, so short notice. But I was speaking to him and his manager last week, Barry O'Callaghan, and Jack was saying Jack's manager was saying that, it is a tough fight for him, but the opportunity was very, very good, too difficult to turn down. So he's on Octagon 63, which I think goes down this Saturday. Outside of that, the other big show that's happening is UFC Fight Night. It's Apex Fight Card 100, would you believe? So we've really got to this point already where we've had 100 Apex cards. Yeah, interesting. But, that being said, I mean, I kind of briefly glanced at the card and I thought, it's just an Apex card. But on closer inspection, there are a small handful, mind you, but a handful of fights that maybe are worth catching up on. Usually when these cards roll around, these Apex cards, often the main event might be the only thing that I bother watching back. Like I don't stay up all night to watch them live. I got young kids, so I can't be staying up till 6 a.m. But for an Apex card, for sure, there's no pay-per-view, there's no title fights on the line. It's not something I would really ever do. But usually, on a Sunday, I might catch up on the main event, and the rest of it is like, nah, unless there's somebody who's maybe fighting an Irish fighter soon or something like that, there's no real reason for me to dive into more than maybe one fight on some of these cards. But this one does have 2 or maybe 3 fights that I'm interested in looking at. So I'm just going to run through the card and highlight the ones that are worth checking out. The main event, of course. I mean, when you see the name Neil Magny in a main event slot, it's an Apex card. It's about as apexy as things get in UFC terms. But on closer inspection at the actual fight, I don't know. I think this one is one that we're going to look back on as a defining moment, maybe in the title discussion in the 170-pound division, because I think Carlos Prates has all of the potential in the world to enter into that discussion. I don't know if he has the qualities to become a champion, but I think should he get through this fight, I think we're certainly going to see him fighting guys like Jack Della Maddalena, like Ian Gary, Shavkat Rakhmonov, Leon Edwards. I think we're going to see him enter that pantheon of fighters very, very soon. And that's given the assumption that he gets through Neil Magny this weekend. He's got Neil Magny in front of him. Now, let's talk about Prates first before we dive into Magny. Prates is 3-0 in the UFC. He's on a hell of a winning streak. I'll just glancing at his record here while I'm talking to you guys. It's quite a lot of wins in a row. And actually, when we're speaking about just MMA, I mean, he's done a little bit of professional kickboxing, or says here in his record, modified rules kickboxing. Not 100% sure what that was back in 2021. But the last fight he had in MMA that went to a decision was back in 2019. And his last one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine MMA fights, he has finished every single one of them. Three of those, of course, being in the UFC. He came in off a win over Mitch Ramirez in the Contender Series in August 2023. So he's only in the UFC a wet week, and he had that finish in the second round over Mitch Ramirez. February this year, he made his debut, second round knockout over Trevin Giles. So again, that straight left, the same thing that won him the fight in the Contender Series. He fights out of the southpaw position, and he is super slick. If you guys haven't watched him fight yet, you really need to check this guy out. He is super swift, slick, smooth with his with his striking in particular. He had the knee to the body knockout in the first round over Charles Radke in his second fight in June, and then the big one, he had that step up in competition where he fought the Leech, Li Jingliang. Where was that? That was at UFC 305, the Duplessis and Adesanya card. So that was in August, and I just rewatched that fight there today. Just looks so good. Distance management. He's, as I said, fighting out of the southpaw stance. He's got a 78-inch reach, so he's quite long and rangy, and also his legs are very long. He has that kind of probably a similar physical build to Neil Magny, where he's very long limbed, but he fights completely differently to Magny. He's sharp, dynamic, fast twitch, so he gets those strikes off quicker than you can. He kind of counter strikes a little bit as well. Even though he'll get on the front foot, get in front of you, he will counter strike. So he'll make you miss, and then things like pull counters. And it's that straight left which we saw got him his first two UFC knockouts. That he's very precise with it, but also extremely powerful with it. If you watch back the Magny fight, I was reminded of, or sorry, the Li Jingliang fight. I was reminded of Conor McGregor's performances over the likes of Dennis Seaver and Diego Brandao, where he's corralling his opponent along the side of the fence, and the opponent just cannot find a way out, and he's just walking and staying, moving laterally, staying in front of him, and unleashing that straight left down the pipe with that long range, and just with the speed and the precision. Power he carries in those shots is ridiculous. He has a lovely head kick too, which he throws onto the end of his combination sometimes. So I was very impressed every time I've seen him. And that last fight, the Li Jingliang one, that was, a step up in competition. Now, he's facing Neil Magny this weekend, which you might be seeing as a bit of a step up in competition too. I'm not 100% sure that that's a massive step up in competition from Li Jingliang, but what it is it's a step up maybe in name value, in that Neil Magny has had, let me double check it here, I think it's something in the region of 33 UFC fights. Would I be right? Yes, I would be right. That was a decent guess. I knew it was something around there because I'd read the stats before, but he's been kind of, fighting in and around the rankings over the last while. But we look at his results. Neil is, the quintessential gatekeeper there at the top end of the division. When they want a guy to maybe break into that upper echelon of the rankings, which we saw Ian Gary do. Ian Gary put a beating on him, and has moved forward in terms of the rankings. He fought, his last loss before that was against Gilbert Burns. His last loss before that was against Shavkat Rakhmonov. So, the guys who are up at the top end of the division have to get through Neil Magny to make it into that sort of upper echelon discussion, whereas he's picking up wins over, good fighters too. So like the likes of Mike Malott and Daniel Rodriguez, D-Rod, of course, Max Griffin, Jeff Neal. So the guys who are sitting maybe at the lower end of the rankings, or maybe just outside the rankings, he's taking care of those. But the guys who are, progressing into the top 10, he's not really getting the wins over those guys. So he's better a little bit than Li Jingliang. I don't think he's massively better, but as I said, the fact that he's been around so long, he's maybe held in some slightly higher regard than Li Jingliang. So this is the logical next step for a fighter like Carlos Prates. Carlos is, he's around a while, but he's only in the UFC for 3 fights in real terms. So when you beat a Neil Magny, the opponents that are waiting after that, there's nothing easy. So, you know, good that he's getting this fight in before he maybe gets paired off with a JDM or even a Gilbert Burns or someone like that who's probably maybe a little step too far from in his development at the moment. We think, we don't know, but when we look at this fight this weekend, what we're going to look at is what he brings to the table, and I don't think I don't think when I look at him that I see a fighter who can't do what Ian Gary did to Neil Magny. Ian Gary pieced up Neil Magny, didn't need the speed, the technique, the skill, just the overall quality was too much for Neil Magny. As I said, Neil Magny is a very good fighter, but I think if Carlos Prates fights to his potential, you're going to see a guy that's maybe looking past him in the rankings. I'm going to take a look at the UFC rankings right now, actually, and we are going to see who weights just above Neil Magny. Now, Neil Magny could make this fight ugly. He has the skill set to do this and maybe just stink the place out, but eke out a decision victory. But then once we look past him, look at the quality that's sitting above Neil Magny. You've got Vicente Luque, Michael Venom Page. And then slightly above that, there's the likes of Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and guys like that that are falling down the rankings. So maybe someone like a Wonderboy Thompson who looks like he's done. He looks like he's past his best. If he gets through this fight, you could see him in there with a Vicente Luque. You could see him in there with a Wonderboy, someone like that. So there's room here for him to grow, but he's going to have to do it quickly. He gets through this fight, like I said, there's very few easy tests, and well, no easy tests, but even there, I'm trying to cherry pick some names that you could maybe see him beating before he gets into the discussion of the Jack Della Maddalenas, the Sean Brady's, the Ian Garys, the Shavkats, those kind of guys. So it's going to be a quick learning on the job thing for Carlos Prates, but it's certainly a main event of some intrigue. UFC Fight Night 100. It's at an apexy card, but the main event, we're going to learn a lot about Carlos Prates. We're going to learn if he's ready to make that step up. Now, the co-main event, I believe, is gone, isn't it? The Cody Garbrandt fight, that's gone now. So he's out. He's done. So yeah, we've lost that fight. And I'm looking on Tapology here, and the fight that they have sitting in the co-main event here, I mean, we can see a drop off in quality. There's a couple of fights that are sitting here just behind the main event. Karolina Kowalkiewicz, she's 39 years old, I think, and she's fighting Denise Gomes. And yeah, strawweight fight, women's fight. Let's have a quick glance at these two fighters' records. There's neither of these two fighters scream high quality at the moment. Gomes 3-2 in the UFC, has a loss to Angela Hill on her record there. So I mean, that kind of says, yeah, no, that says enough to me. I'm not even going to dive any further into that. I don't think she's there. Karolina Kowalkiewicz, I know she's done very well since her comeback. I think was there a point where she kind of retired or floated the idea of retirement? She lost her last fight in May against Yasmin Lucindo. Okay, no shame in that. Lucindo's very good. She won 4 on the bounce before that. But then prior to that, yeah, there's that big losing run she was on. She lost 5 on the bounce. Jessica Andrade, Michelle Waterson Gomez, Alexa Grasso, Yan Janan, and Jessica Penn. And, that came up to 2021. I think there was a little while of retirement there, and she came back, has been picking up wins maybe outside the upper echelons of the division. But at 39 years old and maybe just being too good for some of those type of fighters, she's not really going to be a fighter that we're looking at as going, troubling the title discussion at strawweight. So, yeah, the fact that fight's sitting in the co-main event kind of says a lot about the quality of the card. Ricky Turcios and Bernardo Sopage is the next fight on the card. That's a bantamweight fight. Now, Ricky Turcios, kind of relatively inexperienced UFC wise. What is he? Yeah, he's 2-2. Has losses to Ayman Zahabi and Raul Rosas Jr. Now, no shame in that. We saw Zahabi last weekend. I think he's broken his way into the rankings with his win now, hasn't he? So he's been looking pretty good. And Raul Rosas Jr. of course he submitted him quite comfortably. Like it was quite one sided, that fight. And Raul Rosas Jr., obviously a fighter of really good potential. And then the two UFC victories that Turcios has over Brady Highstand and Kevin Natividad. So I've never heard of either of those two guys. So yeah, he's not a fighter who's kind of there at the moment, as in like carrying the quality that we need to be looking out for. He hasn't done anything really to make us excited about seeing him. His opponent, Sopage, Swedish, 24 years old, and he's what is he? Is he 0-1 in the UFC? Yeah, lost by that flying knee to Vinicius Oliveira, which happened back in March. Yeah, it was a kind of a highlight reel finish. So that's the only kind of reference point we have of him in his UFC career so far. So maybe he'll be desperate to get the hand raised this weekend, because when you get knocked out spectacularly in your debut, and then you come up against someone like a Ricky Turcios who maybe isn't the highest quality, you don't get through this test, your job could be on the line. So yeah, so again, not a fight to be crazy about seeing. But the one that's listed next on the card is absolutely a fight I'm dying to see. We have the UFC debut of Rainier de Ridder. Now, if you guys don't know who RDR is, he's a Dutch fighter. He has been fighting in one championship for quite a while now, and he's only two losses have come against Anatoly Malakin, isn't it? At two different weight classes. He was the champion himself in one championship, and Malakin kind of hoovered up both of his belts. So he kind of had a bit of a strange falling out with him earlier this year. He went off and he had a fight in UAE Warriors, and there was a dispute over is he or isn't he still under contract with one. So that was interesting. But make no bones about it, this guy is an exceptional MMA grappler. As an all around fighter, we've not really seen him tested so much. Obviously, he's been fighting guys in one championship, and there's not a whole lot of guys there that you would class as, elite level MMA fighters. But he's been dispatching of everybody and anybody there, and he's tested himself in high level grappling matches too. I mean, being in there with Tairu Atolo and Andre Galvao, which are two of the highest level grapplers you can find. But he lost those two fights to Anatoly Malakin, and just didn't have an answer for Malakin in either fight, in either weight class. But he's making his debut here at middleweight. Middleweight and the heavyweight belts in one championship. Obviously, their weight classes are a bit different. I think it's 220 is their light heavyweight and 205 is their middleweight, something like that. But that's with the hydration testing, so it's not kind of an accurate apples and orange or apples and apples kind of comparison. So I'm excited to see how he looks here this weekend. And you know what? The fighter that he's up against, Gerald Meerschaert, is just maybe the perfect matchup for him. So Rainier de Ridder is, as I mentioned, a superb MMA grappler and very, very, very high level. A hell of a lot of submissions on his record. 12 submissions out of his 17 pro wins. 17-2 overall, just those two defeats to Malakin. But he's in here with Gerald Meerschaert, and check this out. Gerald Meerschaert is 37-17, a super experienced fighter. 12-9 in the UFC. 11 of those 12 UFC victories have come by way of submission. And he's been in there and he's lost some fights, and he's been in there with some good guys. I suppose the one that people remember most was that Hamzat Chimaev knocked him out after 17 seconds. But and he's lost to guys like Andrei Petrosky, who's not fantastic. Joe Pfeiffer's very good and has beaten him. Krzysztof Jotko, decent fighter. So, he's not really a fighter that's going to be ever troubling the title picture, but there are a lot of submission victories on his record. And, he's on a 2-fight win streak, so he's finished both Edmund Shabazian and Brian Barberina. Brian Barberina, I think, is gone now, isn't he, out of the UFC? He's finished Bruno Silva. He's finished some decent names back for a little bit further back, like Trevin Giles is decent enough, and anybody else that he fought then that was kind of in the lower levels of the UFC and outside of the UFC. He's not only finished all of these guys, he's submitted them all. So I think he may just have the kryptonite for Rainier de Ridder, or Rainier de Ridder comes through this test. He will be, using his grappling to show us what he's made of. Obviously, that's his preferred path to victory. So if he can outsmart an MMA grappler of the quality of Gerald Meerschaert, that'll be a huge feather in his cap, and that'll give us an indication that this guy, okay, maybe, it's difficult to know whether he can go on yet to trouble the title picture, but he may be a guy that we see ending up fighting at the top end of the division and in some big fights. So floating down the rest of the card, there's not a hell of a lot. I mean, we've got Gillian Robertson fighting again there against Luana Pinheiro. There's one fight there that I would say is maybe worth checking out is Eliseu Zaleski. So if you don't remember this guy, that's the guy that put an awful beating on Benoit Saint-Denis. I think that was in London a couple of years ago. That was the one where the referee was removed from the event straight after it because the fight should have been stopped, and he allowed the fight to continue, and Zaleski just beat the brakes off BSD for the remainder of the fight. So we'll have a quick glance at this guy's record. He's fighting an unbeaten prospect here, but he's 10-4 in the UFC, Zaleski. And his losses coming to the likes of Li Jingliang, Muslim Salikov, Randy Brown. Those guys are good fighters. So it's not like he's just losing to scrubs. He's 37 years old too, and he's got some decent wins here. Abubakar Nurmagomedov, of course, Benoit Saint Denis. So, he's a bit of a test. He also has that win over Sean Strickland back in 2018. Almost forgot about that. And this was quite a while back. I think that one is at welterweight, if I'm not mistaken, when Strickland was fighting, at the weight class where he wasn't really the Sean Strickland that went on to win the title. So this guy's been around the UFC for a while. Like I said, 14 fights. He's a decent fighter. He's a good level fighter, and he's facing off against Zach Scroggin. Now, Zach Scroggin 7-0 coming into the UFC, and this is his debut. He's been fighting FAC, so he does have quite a few finishes on his record. And I'm seeing his record here. There's finishes in, with strikes, with leg kicks, with submissions. So not seeing him in action yet with my own two eyes, but what a fighter to make your UFC debut against. So he's coming in with a lot of hype behind him, presumably at 7-0. Let's see how he does. He's giving away the experience advantage to his opponent, but he could be one worth checking out. Below that on the card, there's not a whole lot else I'm going to be looking at. There's one fight that's open in the card that, really caught my eye, and not for a good reason. Antonio Truccoli is fighting Trezian Gore. Okay, I'll come to Trezian Gore in a minute. Antonio Truccoli, he is, and I'm seeing fighters. There's a small handful of these guys just popping up on the card. You might have heard me mention them a couple of weeks ago. I think it was in the preview 2 weeks ago when I was talking about Shara Bullet, previewing his fight that he had 2 weeks back. So Truccoli fought Shara Bullet in June, okay? And I think Truccoli was he meant to fight, or no, it was Shara Bullet initially meant to fight Joelton Luderbach, and Truccoli came in as a replacement. So Truccoli was fighting, on the regional scene. He had lost, I think, on the Contender Series or something along those lines. Let me check it out here. No, his fight was overturned to a no contest. Yeah, failed a drug test, nandrolone. So served the steroid ban, and interestingly enough, when Joelton Luderbach failed the steroid test, failed for PEDs and fell out of the Shara Bullet fight, they brought in Truccoli, who had just, gotten over a ban. So it kind of makes no sense, So he had a couple of years out of action there. He's had one win since he came back. And next thing you know, he finds himself in the UFC on short notice, lost to Shara Bullet. So, bit of a sketchy situation. But he's in here against a guy this weekend who is 4-2. 6 professional fights in the UFC. Now, this guy hasn't even come in off the Contender Series. He's coming in off the Ultimate Fighter Season 29, which happened 3 years ago. He lost his first 2 UFC fights to Brian Battle and Cody Brundage. Now, bear in mind, he was coming in there at 2-0. Or was it? No, he was coming in at 3-0 overall. Now, he had picked up a couple of wins on the Ultimate Fighter, but you know what I mean? Those don't go counting towards his record. So going into the Ultimate Fighter house, he was 2-0 as a pro. Won a couple of fights there and ended up fighting Brian Battle in the UFC. Cody Brundage, a couple of losses. Did pick up a submission victory in October 2022 against Josh Fremd, and he hasn't fought since. Had a couple of fights fall out last year against Bo Nickel, this year against AJ Dobson, and now he finds himself in here with Antonio Truccoli. So a superly inexperienced fighter. This is just a weird thing for me, seeing a fighter in the UFC with 6 professional fights. I wrote an article this week about Solomon Simon, and Solomon is 5-0, but has 20 something or 9 or 20 amateur fights under his belt already. And I wrote an article about him saying, look, if he wins a couple more fights, he could be, exactly timing right, get onto the Contender Series, because they're looking at guys who have unbeaten records, and they don't mind if these guys have less than 10 fights if they're winning fights and finishing fights. This guy, like, just 6 fights already, and he was coming into the UFC with almost nothing under his belt. It makes no sense. So I don't think this guy has the standout resume to warrant being in the UFC, but he's in there, like I said, he's in there against another guy with questionable UFC status as well. So out of all the UFC fights you're probably going to get, this could probably be one of the more lower standard type of fights you're going to see. So it just jumped off the page at me. It's just not the type of fight you see in the UFC. But hey, it is what it is. That's the modern world of mixed martial arts, as Shawnee says often. These things happen in mixed martial arts. So anyway, that's our UFC card this weekend. Like I said, the big standouts for me, Rainer the Ritter is an interesting one. We want to see how he looks, particularly against a superbly experienced MMA grappler in Gerald Meerschaert. And then, of course, that main event. Let's see what Carlos Prates can do, because if he can do what I think he can do to Neil Magny, he could be just one or two fights away from also being lumped in with that spectacular group of talented fighters who all know how to stand and bang in a really skillful technical manner at the top of the welterweight division. So there's the potential there that this guy could be he could be a really interesting addition to that title discussion. Okay, let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you're looking forward to any of these fights, or if you've watched Prates, what do you think of him? He's definitely one I love to see now, making that next step in his career. Hopefully he does it. Hopefully he does it. All right. Thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for listening. If you're on the Patreon, over and out.